Good morning, everyone. It's amazing to be here this morning and have the opportunity to chair this impact engagement event focusing on design and placemaking in a post-COVID world. And I'd really like to thank Andrew Seeley for inviting me to chair such an exciting panel of speakers this morning. My name's Christina Gaiger, and I'm the president of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. The RIAS is the professional body for all chartered architects in Scotland, a charity and 5,200 member-strong organisation. We offer a wide range of services and products for architects, students of architecture, construction industry professionals, and all those with an interest in the built environment and the design process, and therefore very passionate about the topic we're discussing today. And really our aim is to create a supportive architectural network to improve the quality of Scotland's built fabric. I'm really eager today to hear from the speakers and ensure adequate time for an in-depth Q&A at the end. However, I just wanted to say a few words and perhaps provocations maybe before we start this morning. So the pandemic, as I'm sure we all know, has shone a light on the space around us, its value, its quirks, its accessibility, its importance, and its potential. Over the last few months especially, it's really made me think, what is the built environment and what is a building? And from a historical perspective, buildings provide shelter for various needs. From a scientific perspective, they are kit of parts, a structure, a series of interconnected and designed elements, metal, steel, slate, glass, concrete, and stone. But from a sociological perspective, they contribute to a primary psychological need and are an integral part of daily human life. A building's use, their impact on the everyday, the space around it, and their collective sculpting of the environment puts them at the centre of society, making the built environment, architecture, and the space between a critical and a political matter. The post-COVID world will challenge us to implement responsive design-led futures. The pandemic, the climate emergency, and need for qualitative architecture and construction actually demand that the built environment, its regulations, its procurement system step up. With a focus on efficiency in terms of energy, materials, inclusivity, accessibility, equitable living standards, and really take responsibility for the position the built environment holds and the effect that it actually has on society and the environment. Now, I don't think, I would imagine essentially that when this event was planned, no one here would have predicted that we would be in another lockdown with tragic daily news reports and COVID variants, in the midst. And I very much hope this morning that everyone in this virtual room today is doing okay in such difficult and strange times. The important spaces to us at this time have become pavements where we queue, external niches to dwell, local parks. Homes have become flexible spaces, offices, nurseries, and classrooms overnight. Healthy spaces, future-proofing, and flexibility in design have never been more important. However, as we move forward and build on the responsibility that I've just noted, we must also remember to utilise a retain, recycle, and reuse approach to design and placemaking. It's very easy to overlook these fundamentals that came before the pandemic as well, that we have to take the opportunity to carry through with us, as it's estimated that 80% of our buildings currently standing will still be here in 2045, when we'll supposedly have achieved net zero carbon emissions. It's important to recycle, as 50.7% of all waste in Scotland in 2018 was from the construction and demolition sector. And to reuse, if VAT was not a barrier, would we be more focused on our existing building stock? So these questions have carried through the pandemic and are being thrown into the post-COVID world, which I imagine a lot of ideas which will come about today. So I think it's important that we keep them in mind. It's the idea of a holistic approach to encapsulate the responsibility that I've just noted that's been highlighted by the pandemic and really strive for a robust, adaptive and reactive future for the built environment. So with that in mind, and without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ashraf Salama, Professor of Architecture and Director of Research and of the Cluster of Architecture and Urbanism in the Global South, Department of Architecture from the University of Strathclyde. Professor Slama has led 3 schools of architecture in Egypt, Qatar, and the UK, 2 of which he has founded. His work and research have been focusing on sustainable architectural and urban design with a strong emphasis on the impact of socio-cultural factors on shaping the built environment. Having authored and co-edited 14 books and published over 170 articles and chapters in the international referred press, Professor Slama is the recipient of the 2017 UIA Jean Schumi Prize for Excellence in Architectural Education and Criticism. I'm very excited for this talk, and welcome, Ashraf.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending this event. And I would just like to start by thanking the Andy and the Impact Engagement team for organizing the event and for having me as part of it. And I'm glad to be speaking really about this topic, the topic of our times, within this group of distinguished colleagues. So the talk is about the COVID-19, its impact on people and places. I'll focus on the consequences in terms of reshaping the way in which we think about architecture and urbanism. And here I talk really architecture and urbanism as one thing, and I'm not focusing on buildings or urban spaces. It's a holistic understanding of urbanism and the built environment. So my intention here is to talk about the built environment as it relates to people and users in the context of the pandemic. So I just want to move to the next one. Okay. All right. So the talk is basically about the socio-spatial implications of the condition we find ourselves in, the pandemic or epidemic, if we are talking at a city or urban scale, trying to look at different disciplines and how they contribute to the pandemic. And understanding the implications from a disciplinary perspective and how this should be looked at from various disciplines within the built environment and the wider academic, scientific, and professional communities, and how this could generate people-place narratives that have not existed before. So this is basically the structure of the presentation. And over the past 8 or 9 months since the pandemic started, I've been exploring the impact of the COVID-19 condition, the virus spread on society, and what role architecture and urban design could or should play, mostly at a conceptual, speculative level, more than experimental or empirical. The result of the exploration is a number of articles in different online portals or academic journals, and also various events and various activities across different professional gatherings. But one important thing I would like to mention here is that we also, our students at the University of Strathclyde last year have been impacted by the pandemic condition and have addressed COVID-19 in their master thesis. And the outcome of that is that we developed a new document that really tried to capture the salient characteristics of the urban environment as it relates to the virus spread and the COVID. And this document is going to be made available online very, very shortly, which shows the impacts and in terms of how our students interpret these impacts in their work and in their understanding of this. I will start by some driving concepts which are really important in the context of this discussion. If we notice that current discussions are centered on that idea of new normal, which represents an unfamiliar or atypical condition that will eventually become a stable condition or usual or expected. The problem with the notion of new normal is that we are reacting to change with wishful thinking or wishful hope to stay the same. But the profession of architecture and its education practice and the built environment related disciplines are already challenged before the pandemic. So there were challenges before the pandemic, and then and then further implications after with the pandemic. So here I would introduce the notion of the loss of the stable state. So which argues that there is no stable condition coming, there is no new normal coming. It will be a loss of the stable state, no stability whatsoever coming, which means that we need to create adaptive systems. The creation of adaptive systems mean learning systems. So the argument here is that no new normal, we have lost the stable state in many aspects of life, including architecture and urbanism, and that we need to operate as adaptive and learning systems. The idea or the argument of, if we look at this statement, it's really scary or sad, but it shows the implications of that notion of new normal in a transition period, which we call the new normal, and which is really a fluctuating, unstable state. Societies, communities, and individuals appear to be at odds, speculating the future. Of course, we are also speculating the future as it relates to architecture and urbanism. There are positive aspects and there are good potentials ahead that we need to really focus on. This interesting thing is that the condition we are in at the moment and the move toward the virtual or the digital has been predicted. So if we look at the writings of the mid-80s through maybe mid-2005, around that, we can find that the work of geographers, urban sociologists, and also architects and urban planners introduced the idea of, for example, Castells talk about the global city is not necessarily a physical place, but a process. And this assumption has been questioned by many geographers in the past, and now it is proving valid. It is a process more than a physical place, as we see how international trade and how the global movements of things happening virtually. What also communicate that idea of the move from physical to virtual, the trilogy of William Mitchell, who was the dean of MIT, and he predicted what we are in exactly, and talked about the notion of digital communities. Introduced this trilogy in City of Bits, Electronictopia, and Me++, in which he argues for examining architecture and urbanism in the context of digital communication and the rise of these technologies, trying to offer answers to the question of how the transformation of wireless technology and the spread of it will be a priority and will impact and change our life in the future. With this thinking, it's really important to try to think of transdisciplinarity, and we always talk about it, but we never materialize it. Everybody talks about that idea of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, but it's never materialized, especially in terms of transdisciplinary action. Maybe at an academic level, you can see some forms of collaboration, but at a professional practice level, these collaborations are not really materialized. We don't see in reality, for example, in the professional practice, that social scientists are working with architects, unless it's a massive housing project or something like this. But in mainstream practices, we don't see the idea of transdisciplinarity materialized. And all of us know that the idea is to blur the boundaries of disciplines, where no one discipline can have strong claims over its own direction or in isolation from what's happening in other disciplines. The interesting thing here, if we notice that once we try to collaborate with others, either as architects or planners or urban designers, landscape architects, we start by saying, we don't do it this way. And the moment we say we don't do it this way is the moment we establish boundaries and end up isolating ourselves from knowledge generated by other disciplines. So here the idea is to have transdisciplinary action in addressing issues related to the pandemic. When we look at from a disciplinary perspective, of course, the key visible contributors are medical scientists and public health experts, either at academic institutions or labs, and their role is basically about prevention and treatment. Then we see computer scientists and mathematicians talking about modeling and trying to understand that idea of visualization of the number of infections, mortality rates, and all these aspects across a period of time or in a specific time frame. And now we can see all these terms, the peak, flatten the curve, and all these terms that now the public and mainstream public say these terms and relate to these terms. Then we see social and behavioral scientists who try to provide positive messages within organizations, basically address issues of anxiety, loneliness, mental health, as they relate to specific groups or organizations. So the question now is, where is architecture and where is urbanism? And of course, when we say architecture here, including allied disciplines, interior design, urban design, landscape, urban planning, the role of architecture and built environment professions can be seen through a number of questions. And these are some of the questions. Of course, this list, these are only 4 questions. So the list is not exclusive. We can add more questions. But the questions here about the nature of transformation in urban dynamics post-pandemic, or could COVID-19 alter our understanding of the idea of urban space, the idea of publicness, and the idea of urban life, and the dialectics of urban life and urban form, whether the post-pandemic era generate new environments that accommodate new or emerging lifestyles, living and working styles. And then the engagement with nature is a key element in this. A simple answer to these questions can be found in this slide, which is basically trying to look at new insights into the impact of pandemic on cities, on urban spaces, new understandings of the characteristics of these urban spaces, new conceptions related to emerging lifestyles and the associated living and working patterns, and of course, in academic institutions, research or conducting research to comprehend the social-spatial implications. But ultimately, all of these activities result in design responses, and this is the most important thing. But these design responses cannot be valid without integration of knowledge generated from other disciplines beyond architecture and beyond urbanism. So here, if you notice that adopting the transdisciplinary thinking or perspective, which crosses the boundaries of disciplines, argues that architects and urban planners cannot do it alone, cannot address issues related to the built environment with respect to the impact of the pandemic on their own. When we look at the constituents of post-COVID-19 urbanism, we can see a number of areas that form key factors. And again, this diagram is not exclusive. Again, we can add more circles here to address other dynamics or other factors. But here I'm just focusing on 3 urban dynamics, distancing measures, living and working patterns, and how these require specific types of expertise to be integrated with the knowledge of architects and planners. For example, urban dynamics and how they are impacted by the post-global condition, restrictions on travel. So it requires transportation engineers, urban planners, urban geographers to work together on these issues and understanding and analyzing the implications. If we are talking about distancing measures, for example, require the expertise of architecture, environmental psychology, disaster psychology. All of these disciplines will benefit the practice, of course, the generation of knowledge and eventually the practice of architecture and designing spaces. Addressing new living and working patterns require working with anthropologists, ethnographers, and understanding really past experiences of people and their preferences. So in looking at the COVID-19 condition and how it generated additional implications and interest in examining the socius or the social dimension of architecture, including a range of issues related to public health, social distancing, social interaction, well-being, and many other issues. And these are emerging areas with significant social and spatial implications. So if we look at a higher level or at a global level in terms of travel and transport, the condition has led to polarities with many severe and negative impacts, but also positive impacts. Global travel restrictions are leading to destroyed economies in certain contexts, unemployment, dramatic reduction in industrial production. But at the same time, the reduction in pollution levels and carbon emissions by 25% in less than 2 months, and this is based on NASA reports. This is an image of Beirut, Lebanon, and it's impossible to see this clear sky in a city like Beirut in normal circumstances. So after the pandemic, this was the outcome, which shows, of course, the pollution level. Many of us are looking at satellite images, trying to see differences, whether in Italy, when things have started and became really massive impact in terms of lockdown in Italy first, and then in other places around Europe. This one is about Wuhan, China, which is said to be the source of the disease, has also witnessed massive reduction in pollution levels. And this is comparing basically March 19 and March 20. And the pink here shows the pollution levels. And in March 20, this has been reduced significantly. When we look at, again, the implications are witnessed in all aspects of life, including sharp decline in the use of public transportation. And in certain lockdown periods, it reached in some cities to reduction of 90%. And I assume that at the time now, it's reduction in 90% where we are with the lockdown measures that are existing at the moment. And this, of course, has urban implications where effective policies, incentives for using alternative forms of transportation, cycling, walking to work, are now being discussed as part of city policies. So we can see impacts also at a global scale. The pandemic has impacted global infrastructure, global networks. Many are arguing that airports and seaports are the sources of virus spread in a specific context. And these are basically showing how the global condition is impacted by the pandemic and by the reduction in operations in these environments. Noting that, if we want to compare, for example, between SARS in 2003, 4, 5, and here, what is happening now with coronavirus, SARS impacted global entities, but they are not as global as London and New York. Singapore and Hong Kong were impacted by the SARS to a great extent, but it hasn't reached Europe or Western Europe or North America. And this is also another level of impact. The interesting thing is that when we see the level of discussions that took place, especially in the early months of the pandemic, the discussion was centered on mainstream cities. And that's also a defect in the overall urban discourse. Marginalizations continue to exist. No discussion whatsoever, maybe until June or July 2020, about squatter settlements, informal settlements, slums in Brazil or in South Africa. So all of these had implications, and people started to speak about these aspects or these settlements and how the pandemic should be addressed also in these contexts. So the question that is really important here is about density and about urban density, and many have discussed urban density, and I don't want to really dwell on discussing in details these aspects, but the question is density important, or is it impacting virus spread? Or how can we deal with density in the future, urban density, and how this would be influencing the way in which we think about squatter settlements on the peripheries of cities like this, or even in more organized but massive high-rise agglomerations in the context of Hong Kong. And that density question is really important. To look at it, there was a very interesting study that examined 180 cities around the world, and the study was published just 2 months before the pandemic, and it was focusing on a meta-physical scale, trying to look at how urban density impact cities economically and the well-being of people and specific groups within these cities. So it shows the significant positive aspects of urban density in these 180 cities. And this applies to contexts in North Africa and the Middle East, and to contexts in North America. For example, this is Vancouver, and how Vancouver is thriving on significant urban density when compared to other North American cities. We have learned throughout the history that density is important, and when we talk about traditional cities, traditional fabrics, traditional urban environments, we always refer to urban density and how urban density was successful. And there was it's like a hidden formula of generating a fabric or an urban tissue that balance between people, needs, diversity, and density. We have learned also that traditional cities were characterized by vibrancy, intensive social engagement, economic and cultural diversity. And in most urban regeneration projects, we try to simulate these environments. So developing urban visions, for example, in high density urban environments, there is always a reference to traditional cities and the higher density that were employed in these cities. So there are two views about density. One view advocates it, and another view goes against it. The one that goes against it say, okay, when SARS virus spread in 2003 to 2005, cities in China were not as dense as they are now. So they refer to coronavirus as, okay, it got spread and became so contagious because of the density and because of the density of Chinese cities. But that view ignores the fact about the virus itself, and that it's really different from SARS in terms of how much more contagious it is. The other view that advocates density adopt the view that Hong Kong and Singapore are very high density urban environments and cities, but they managed to control the virus spread, while London and New York, who are less dense, have not managed to do this. So which raises a very, very important question. It's not about density as yes or no, it's about management of density. So in a post-pandemic environment, it's not about questioning density. It is about management of density, and many are arguing for this, where architects, urban designers, planners, and decision makers need to balance built form density and population density, and how this can also allow for containment of spread of the virus. So that's an important aspect that we really need to consider in the future. When we look here, also urban sprawl versus city centers and high density urban environment, a very, very important study conducted at Johns Hopkins University, which is the source of, or one of the important sources of knowledge about coronavirus in the context of America. Intensive research over the past few months about whether density is the reason of virus spread. And they examined 900 communities around the US and concluded that there is no correlation between density and infection rates, but there is a higher death rates in places described as sprawl. So it's urban sprawl that could cause issues related to infection and more death. So now there is another question, what does it mean to inhabit the city? Of course, we know that cities have different qualities and different urban qualities. Within Europe, there are different scales and there are indices that rate cities based on the quality of air, quality of urban life, health, well-being, and many other aspects. So one would question, what does it mean to inhabit the city post-pandemic or even during pandemic? So here I rely on a number of concepts, and all of them are emerging from environmental psychology, which has close relationship with architecture. So concepts like home range and home zone, and I'll show some examples of these quickly. Place attachment, personal space, all of these aspects are important to start to revisit and re-examine as we move forward with new design standards and new specifications for whether for buildings or urban environments. So one important aspect is that the question of whether we're going to move from city centers to the peripheries of cities or even to rural areas. So that idea of seasonal migration, for those who can afford, of course. So in safe periods, people are living closer to the heart of the city and the urban mass. And then in risky periods, they move. It's like exactly the idea of a weekend house. Then they move outside the city on the periphery or even to rural areas. So that's an important thing. And we really need to have empirical information and empirical evidence whether this as a phenomenon is taking place. The other idea is about the notion of home zone. Home zone is the immediate place where people live. So it's around the home environment. and home range is the larger residential environment. If the pandemic continues to exist as we are witnessing, it is starting to occupy part of the collective psyche of people and of society. So people now have a tendency to stay within the home zone and avoid engagement with the home range. And of course, we still need to have empirical evidence on these phenomena. Of course, one can see patterns of these activities taking place, but still we need really to examine this in a more rigorous manner. When we look at the concept of place attachment, it argues that people attach to places based on a number of factors, and you can see the list here. The interesting thing: aesthetics, heritage, family connections, recreation, biological diversity, all of these important aspects, but health and public health do not exist in the discourse of place attachment. So likely in the future, public health will become a key determinant in making people attached to places and prefer specific places over others. This applies to a wide variety of environments, whether in outdoor spaces and children play areas. One would assume that a wide spectrum of settings will need to really address that notion of public health, personal safety, personal health, public health, so at different scales and at different levels, would be important in the future. And this applies to different types of user groups. We've seen the children, and also the impact on the elderly is so critical. Elderly and how they can engage with the environment in a manner that doesn't warrant or generate risk to their life. Another concept is about that idea of proxemics, and all of us know the work that has been developed in the 60s. There were two very, very important books by anthropologists, The Hidden Dimension of Architecture or The Fourth Dimension of Architecture by Edward White, where he proposed these distances based on the type of relationships that people have. So, and he classified 4 zones that range from the intimate zone to the public zone. There is no doubt that this kind of dimensions and areas and distances will have to be revisited in the context of the pandemic. That idea of a bubble surrounding a human body that stretches in risky periods and shrink in safe periods would be really important to address as we develop new design standards and design specifications. And this applies to interior spaces within buildings or public environments. We have done over the past 3-4 years a number of research exercises with our students and with our researchers on the people engagement and people behavior in public spaces and aspects of territoriality, social interaction, social engagement, and all of these aspects. And I'm sure these studies before the pandemic are very different now. So we need to address these studies within the context of the pandemic and try to look at the dialectics of urban life and urban form and how they should integrate. The interesting thing is the urban space has been defined throughout the history as a place of encounter, assembly, simultaneity. Now, the question is it going to be the same? Public space is where we share with strangers, people who aren't our relatives, friends, or work associates. And these definitions are very, very important. And all urban designers and urban design discourse relate to these definitions when we talk about public environments and public spaces. Now, the point is, many of the aspects that used to be seen as negative qualities of urban environments will be moving to the positive side of things in the context of the pandemic. So the entire discourse about urban form and urban life is being and need to be reshaped. We can look, this is an examination of a number of spaces in Glasgow city centre's 9 spaces, which tries to juxtapose the idea of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, and how certain urban spaces are fully deserted and other spaces are still functioning, not necessarily in strict lockdown periods, but they are still functioning. So issues related, as we say, the spatial qualities will be changing in terms of how we understand them and how we address the qualities that used to be described as negative qualities, and how they are going to be positive qualities. The other point is about the engagement with nature, and that's a very important thing. Bringing nature to the city is becoming part of the discourse, biophilic design, and all of the aspects that relate to bringing or integration with nature, and how preference of people as individuals will be to engage with nature and prefer the engagement with nature over the engagement with other people, or even over the engagement with built environments and buildings. But one has to differentiate between 2 different types of nature. There is the natural nature, which is the nature in the forest or the wilderness, and the managed version of nature, and how this managed version of nature can be integrated into cities in a more natural way, not superficial way. When we say the urban design discourse will be changing, it has been conceived throughout the last 40, 50 years in terms of psychological conceptions, physical attributes, and actions and behaviors as constituents of places and public environments. There is nothing about health. There is nothing about public health, and this will become a very important aspect. Moving into some also human actions that are taking place now, we can understand or extract lessons that must be learned by architects and urban designers and are about the everyday environment and everyday architecture and urbanism. And we can see various aspects of adaptation and appropriation, how, for example, balcony parties and jazz events are taking place in certain streets within cities. So basically, certain elements were designed for a specific purpose are now being used for other purposes, which also would generate in the future new understanding of these environments. How neighborhood spaces between buildings can accommodate and can cope with lockdown measures would be important. While of course we can see these as part of the appropriation activities, yes, it looks funny and from a first glimpse, but it's very meaningful in terms of the nature of interaction and the nature of how people will in the future will have to appropriate and understand the appropriation of spaces, and how designers will have to understand people, actions and activities, and their adaptation and appropriation of spaces. An important thing, there will be new forms of appropriation which will define the future of being social in the public environment. And that's an important aspects of the future. Workplaces, it applies to workplaces. What is the type of collaboration and engagement at work, and how this will change our understanding of work environments and work spaces. If we look, and it applies to wide variety and wide range of spaces, the same thing applies to educational environments. What kind of change will take place in the future? how social distancing will impact our perception of engagement, for example, in student lounges. That's an important thing. How learning environments in the future will offer safe environment, and now we can see some schools have started to really conduct adaptation and become more appropriate to a pandemic condition. When we look here, I'm just trying to get close to the very end of the presentation. Emerging living and working patterns will have to be addressed from a wide spectrum of view. And here I'm just trying to refer to that transdisciplinary view and adopt the transdisciplinary thinking in looking at the future of home and working environments. And how really knowledge from sociology, anthropology, and ethnography can enable our understanding of home environments in the future. And whether we're talking about home environments, private homes, or we're talking about social housing, but in all cases, we really have to relate to ideas related to how people perceive housing as a result of past experiences and as a result of their needs and wants. How typological preferences, what kind of typologies or housing typologies people will prefer based on their attitudes in terms of engagement with others or isolating themselves from others. And this is coming really from anthropology and sociology. How, for example, the wage earner, the career-oriented person, the wage earner person, and the self-employed person will understand and will adapt their home environments in the future, which would lead to a massive range of possibilities about aspects and issues architects, urban designers, and planners will have to address in the future. And if we look at this diagram, again, this is an extensive list of things and activities that architects and urban planners would need to engage in the future to address the pandemic condition. And this also ranges from urban dynamics to distancing measures to living and working patterns. I will not go through the list, but I will leave the presentation to colleagues, maybe to make it available to everyone. And I will conclude with this slide by saying that quality of urban life, health at the urban scale and at the building scale, environmental justice with respect to vulnerable groups, in particular, will have to be integral components of the future discourse in architecture and urbanism. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashraf. That was absolutely fascinating. I feel slightly transfixed by the topics that you've just kind of ran through in that 40 minutes. And I'm still resonating a little bit on we need to operate as adaptive and learning systems. And I think it's going to take me a while to process that. And I hope that there'll be an opportunity at the end to delve into that a little bit more in the Q&A with the whole panel involved. So thank you for that. Apologies at the beginning, I didn't mention that there is a question function in the webinar. And I see that there's already a question there already. If anyone wants to pop questions in as we go through the panel speakers, we'll then revisit them at the end at the Q&A with everyone involved and have a discussion about those. There's also a Twitter handle for today, which is in the chat function, which is hashtag #SustBuild21. So if anyone wants to tweet about what's been spoken about today, that would be fantastic. So on to our next speaker, Petra Bieberbach, who is the CEO of PAS, which is an award-winning charity and social enterprise, a building active citizenship. It's Scotland's leading place and active citizenship charity. And for the last 25 years, they've been supporting a planning system that's inclusive, positive, and innovative, where individuals and communities help to shape the future of their place. Petra's also been a member of the board and chair of Planning and Access Committee, and also a member of the board of directors for Zero Waste Scotland in the past brings a huge discussion today. So over to you, Petra. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there, thank you very much. And how do I follow this? Our early speaker, that was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed it. Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about what PASS is doing in order bringing the place agenda and the people together, and its unique approach in doing so. And also, I guess, for me, with my environmental background, I'm very keen that we are also driving further the sustainability agenda, and that is why it's such an honor to be speaking here today. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh yeah, I can do it there. Thank you. That's it. So who is PASS? We are a charity, but also a social enterprise. We have been going for over 25 years here in Scotland. And primarily we're here to help individuals and communities to navigate the planning system and also to be more proactively involved in the system. We have over 400 volunteers who are coming from the built environment professionals. So they're not just planning professionals, but they're architects, urban designers, transportation engineers, and also recently with our work in schools, we have also some teaching professions who have come to volunteer. So again, it's a broad range, and it's helpful to have those different skills available to the communities. The primary focus is still on the advice service, but we also do a lot of skills training for elected members, for community groups, for people that want to be active in the place agenda and understand fully how they can go about it. And increasingly, we're doing work with local communities around the local place plan agenda and creating local place plans, which I'll talk a little bit later. PASS is very much, the ethos of PASS is very much a Gaigersian approach. It is about linking the place to work and to folk. And as Patrick Gaiger said, town planning is much more than place planning. It's about work planning. It's about essentially about folk planning. So this has never been more true than right now. And if a place functions well, then the people in it will be happy, will be empowered, will take an active part. So currently, and it was very much explained by our previous speakers, reevaluating the experience of place is absolutely vital now. We find that the pandemic has shown a real light on the inequality that exists in society, and that is often borne out by the way we are constructing and building places and homes. So for me, the coronavirus pandemic definitely has resonance with the planning system. We need to drive rapid and radical change to our experience of place, and the impact on mental and physical well-being and health is very much in the forefront now. So we have to learn from this experience and we have to adapt. One of the interesting correlation for our advice service has been over the last 10 months, the number of calls to our advice service has rocketed in terms of how can I adapt my home? What can I do to make home living and home learning a more positive experience? This is especially in areas where we have houses of not the best standard, not the highest space standard. And these are the kind of things we really need to drill into. So the experience that we're all gaining has to be fed into a new way of doing. But also places a focus for change. And I think it's about the connection and the aspiration. In Scotland, the place standard tool has been trialed, and we use that very much to start a conversation with communities. So place is as much about the technical know-how as it is about how we feel, how we like to get about, how safe do we feel. And it is about making sure that we start the conversation always, how do you feel about your place? So the discussion has to be about placemaking and the well-being agenda, but at the same time, it's also about the civic engagement. Too often, only people that understand the system are in the room. We are very much keen to link everybody to the discussion around place and foster civic engagement. Placemaking is the natural connector of people and the public services and national outcomes. And of course, now we have the place principle, which precisely does that, connects the well-being, connects the public services and the national outcomes. So there is an opportunity for change. We need to take actions to deliver what our communities need. And the change is how we plan, design, and deliver homes that fit the need and desire of our communities, older people and also the younger people. We need to have a more flexible and adaptable zero carbon construction methodology. As it was mentioned before, over 55% of our construction waste still ends up in landfill. That's just no longer, we can't allow that anymore to happen. So the construction methodology really is very important to have zero waste construction, and modular construction fits into that. We need to support individuals and communities, their aspiration for self-build and for co-housing, which I'll come to later on. And also in order to tackle loneliness and isolation, it's not just about construction, it's very much about the human being and its role in place. We have opportunities. Now, the Planning Scotland Act came before the pandemic, but within that, there's sufficient, I would say, levers to actually start a discussion and repurpose. So the National Planning Framework is a new format, and it will replace most of the local supplementary guidance. It streamlines it, but it also provides new opportunity for a bottom-up approach to place. There will be regional spatial strategies, and there will be an introduction to the purpose of planning. What is it all about? The introduction of local place plan, I think, will drive the democratic deficit that we have for too long experienced. There will be a new guidance on community participation, introduction of mediation as a tool, which will, I think, again, help us to understand the different sides, the different values better, and actually be and have engaged dialogue. For me, very personally, there is also a new duty to involve gypsy travelers as well as children and young people. For too long, gypsy travelers have been excluded from the discussion around place, and children and young people have not been seen. This is very vital, especially now with the new UN Charter of the Rights of the Child, and that's being fed into the Scots law, which is wonderful. Young children must be involved in decisions that affects them, and place affects them. So then, of course, there's also the introduction of place sufficiency assessment and introduction to self-built housing and consent areas. And again, very vital, the change to have mandatory training for elected members. If you understand how the planning system works and you make decisions on it, it is vital that you know how it works in its understanding. Then we have the local place plan, which I want to show on the next two slides very quickly. There's an opportunity to support community-led building. We hope very much so. So the local place plan is a new type of plan. It's a place plan is a proposal as to the development of the use of land, but it may also identify land and buildings. And again, this is something that we don't talk enough about. We have a huge amount of small parcels of vacant and derelict land, but equally we have a large number of houses that are empty, buildings that are not being utilized, and all over Scotland, I think the estimate is about for 35,000 empty buildings that could be repurposed. And I think we need to bring our local community and their thinking into that debate as well. So the local place plan has to have obviously regards to the local development plan. So there is a hierarchy there. It has to fit within the national planning framework, but it must also include an evidence base that it has included the views of the wider community and also the views of local councillors. So this is for the first time a real opportunity for communities, landowners, housing providers and local authorities to work together for the benefit of their areas. And then the Planning Scotland Act again 2019, which we are going through the technical details now, asked for greater participation, more informed and more representational decision making. So again, as I said before, there's a new guidance on community participation, what it means. So we're moving away from the term consultation to participation, which is much more inclusive and more empowering. Again, as mentioned, mediation before, and duties of gypsy travellers and young people, all of that is now enshrined in the Act. So we have the National Planning Framework, which is currently being consulted on widely by community groups, but also young people. And National Planning Framework also has now climate change within its within its objectives. Again, what can it do to help tackle the climate change emergency? There's also now a requirement to bring the needs of older people and the voices of children and young people. Again, as it was said before, we do have an aging population, but I think we need to remind ourselves there's a huge amount of active aging nowadays. So the places have to reflect that as well. Then we have the gate check, and which will be a new process in the preparation of the development plan. So again, early on, greater community participation in the chaos. And then we have support for community-led housing, and co-housing is something that we're particularly interested in as an organization, because we're getting more and more community groups wanting to have co-housing, which is an intentional community, shared interest, aspirations and ethics, who want to work together and live together, so they have that physical space. And it's actually quite interesting, because by having that, we're tackling not only the housing crisis, but we're also tackling the loneliness pandemic that's happening. So again, there's huge interest in the co-housing agenda right now. So community-led housing, co-housing in Scotland, we often think that, and I think I mentioned this before, we often think that Scotland, that co-housing came from Europe, especially in Denmark, but of course the first co-housing was actually in 1939 in Camp Hill in Aberdeenshire. So Scotland had been the home for co-housing, or at least a cradle, but unfortunately, really where it's happening now is in mainland Europe. So maybe we can revisit that and actually looking at it in a much more holistic way. There are some exciting initiatives on the way, especially for repurposing larger buildings, which could be quite helpful. Here is another area that I'm keen on exploring, and that is the idea of multi-generational living, our activities. In the heart of New Haven is a project that is in Edinburgh, in the New Haven community, where an old Victorian primary school building has been repurposed, and we worked with the community and the school children and young people to try and get a new purpose for this building in terms of turning it into a multi-generational centre. So the asset transfer was successful, and the community is now waiting for the final outcome in terms of its funding stream. So I think that's all I have to say. I wanted to gallop very quickly. The only other thing I would maybe say is that as a vice chair of Link Group, which is a housing association here in Scotland, Link Group has just recently got the first housing association in Scotland who got the sustainability accreditation from Ritterval, which is a European accreditation. And what we're now driving through is hopefully to influence the supply chain, which as a housing association we can do as a group, and also work with our tenants and our staff to really embed a new awareness of the sustainability agenda and the connection that to culture, how we build, and nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra. That's fascinating. I mean, I honestly didn't know with regards to one of the first co-housing examples being in Aberdeen, which is really interesting, and I kind of want to find out more about that. If we were kind of the cradle for it, as you said, why didn't it continue? Why wasn't it successful? And how can we learn from that and bring it back? And I think it's fantastic to hear of examples of it happening again. And I know that some of our members are working on co-housing projects and multi-generational living. So it is creeping back into the built environment, but how can we learn and re-implement? And I think that that's really important. So thank you for bringing your knowledge to the table there. And it's also great to hear obviously about the Link Group as well, and the driving forward that supply chain and sustainability conversation through that, because it's key. Both speakers this morning have noted that we have to work together. It has to be collaborative. It can't be one person driving one agenda at the moment. And I think that's starting to show that it is happening, which is great to hear. So thank you for that. So we've had a few more questions come in as well, which is great. So keep them coming through the event, and we'll get to them at the end when we can put everyone together and have a discussion about them. Our next speaker today is Daniel McKendry, who's Principal Landscape Architect at Architecture and Design Scotland. He's an urbanist, geographer and chartered landscape architect with almost 30 years experience in the private and public sectors on a wide variety of complex projects involving urban design, community planning, infrastructure, economic development, town centre management and the governance of placemaking. Danny works across a range of projects at Architecture and Design Scotland, the National Design Champion, and leads on design advice for public infrastructure, tourism and strategic place priorities advice for housing. Doesn't sound like a small task at all. So look forward to hearing this and your perspective on it, Danny. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, and thanks to Andy for organising, and thanks to earlier speakers. Fascinating stuff to follow up on, and hopefully I'll be able to touch upon some of that as well. So, yeah, I work for Architecture and Design Scotland. It's a non-departmental agency of government, and we're here to kind of, I suppose, promote the value of design in improving everyday lives. And my role as a landscape architect hopefully contributes to that. And I was tasked today with discussing the future of landscape architecture. So, you know, a nice small subject for 15 or 20 minutes. So we'll see how we go on with that. And it's just this a personal perspective, but I'm trying to tie it into what I've heard earlier on, and also tie it into what we have been working on in Architecture and Design Scotland recently. So if I move my slides on. So I took a little look at this and had a think about it. And back in 2016, the Landscape Architecture Foundation over in the States called upon academics and practitioners from around the world to think about, you know, a 21st century declaration for landscape architecture. And a lot of the priorities from then are still very relevant, and even through the lens of COVID are maybe even more relevant. And, you know, some of the things that they're saying to landscape architects is that they should must address, you know, air, water, food and waste, improve upon the sort of urbanization as usual approach, have a better understanding of the wild, and that's really interesting regarding, you know, where COVID potentially came from. There needs to be more landscape architects in all walks of life. We must diversify, and I'll touch upon this. We need to get more political. As I think all people working in urbanism need to be certainly politically astute and aware, if not necessarily politicized. We need to be better at leveraging green infrastructure into broader goals. We must be very much aware of the experiential aspects of design, you know, designing for people. Must generate new fields of interest, expertise, to stay relevant. And we must be pragmatic. And it's touched upon by Ashraf, you know, our role in education and our type of education of landscape architecture needs to be, I suppose, refined to meet current needs. And if we do a trawl of, you know, what's hot in landscape architecture, lots of things come up, and this is just a random thing, it could be in anything, but, you know, climate change, greener standards, suburbanization, suburban town centres, integrated transport, all these things that we're very familiar with are key elements of modern landscape architects' work, and things that we are certainly, you know, are very aware of in the work that we've been asked to carry out in Architecture and Design Scotland. So this little doodle I share with you here, well, this is I've called it designing at scale, but it was a thought I had, and it's based on Professor Steinitz, Harvard School of Landscape Architecture, who contributed to that landscape declaration back in 2016 and continued to write about it for a number of years afterwards. But it's interesting to look at this, you know, as a landscape architect, but from any professional background or working background. At the top, you know, it's a kind of river catchment with urban meeting points, towns, villages along that, with a rural hinterland. The middle bit is it's a city grid with parks, greenways, river frontages, etc. And the lower doodle is, you know, a domestic scene. And interestingly, landscape architects through the course of time, particularly through the 20th century, have shifted back and forth, up and down through these different scales. And, you know, I suppose some of the more famous ones, you know, the Olmsteds, etc., who are involved in park design, you know, where that kind of middle section, that was considered to be the role of a landscape architect. And then I suppose with time, people became more specialised and become more into detailed specifications of smaller parklands, domestic settings, housing, etc. And although then over in the States, people like McCarg, obviously coming from Scotland originally, were working at that strategic planning scale and that sort of landscape scale. And all of the professions have shifted about within these. You know, architects have gone from domestic through to city urbanism to strategic stuff. So have our civil engineering colleagues as well. And touching on what colleagues have said earlier, I think there's really something about actually a collaborative approach to our education across disciplines, and actually everybody learning at that strategic scale and then working down and understanding at the sort of deeper skills as they move through their work, and then maybe specialising later on. What tends to happen is that people tend to work at the smaller scales and then later on struggle to grasp with the strategic scale of things. And I think that's certainly a problem that we encounter when we're providing advice across professions and across different organisations. So it's something to bear in mind, I think. And I suppose trying to get to grips with this, some of the work the Scottish Government has been promoting recently, and we've been trying to promote, is this place-centred view of our work around the place principle, which is really about actually just getting your act together as an individual organisation or as an individual, but also collectively with partners. And, you know, on rare occasion we see real disorder and confusion, you know, where people are all just doing different things without any coordination. That's less common nowadays. Quite often we see individual impact people with very clear focus of what their role is as they see it, but all marching off in different directions. Usually the better places and better pieces of work are around this coordinated impact. Everybody's sort of aligned and doing good stuff, but not really collectively working. And I think where we want to go to is this collective approach of aligning our investments, our intellects, our professional skills, our issues, our briefs, so that what we're delivering in a place-focused way, in whatever context, one that's a carbon challenged one that's a pandemic challenged one, or both, as we're at just now, we're working collectively, and that's really, really important in terms of the types of work that the Scottish Government are trying to promote. Some of the work that's been done over the last few years is still very relevant, and like the place standard tool, and I'll touch upon this again later, is this kind of asking questions of our place. You know, how's our place working? What's working well? What's not working so well? Across a wide range of experiences: transport, economy, space, freedom, senses of ownership. And these have all changed, and I think we could possibly mean more, I suppose, highlighted in people's minds across the profession, but also I think that, across the public, a better understanding of what works and doesn't work and what's meaningful and important to them, particularly these more difficult times. So that's something I think is more pertinent, and I think landscape architects can take a very good overarching role in understanding that, especially through the course of time, which we have sort of ingrained in our disciplinary training. Some of the work we've also been doing in Architecture and Design Scotland is around this idea of understanding how to write better briefs. We quite often call this place parts process, and this idea of, you know, if you're trying to write a brief for a future, how we better understand what the vision of that future is, trying to get a collective, collaborative understanding of that amongst stakeholders, understanding the processes of communication, governance, delivery, management, etc., learning that are required, and a kind of agreed understanding of the parts, the stuff that needs to be built. Quite often these are you get 2 out of 3 of these working well. You know, you have really good structures of governance in place, and you know, a shopping list of things and parts people want to deliver, but less clear on the place vision. We feel that all 3 are really required. I think that kind of getting that message over is a really important role for all the professions, but I think landscape architecture can get that big scale strategic view is really, really important. And in getting the priorities from place, person, process helps us in the tasks of leadership, briefing, procurement, decision making, policy writing, engagement, etc., and learning, as I mentioned. The other thing that we've been working on a lot, and I think is really, really important, is we're good at mapping where the things we care about, and that's some of the stuff that's been done in place standard and some of the conversations that people are having about the places that are important to them, particularly at this time. But I think it's also really important to think about a year in the life of a place, how a place works, how different places change through time, and that was touched upon in some of the slides that were shown earlier on, and what are the daily lives of individuals. Different people experience things in different ways. We should understand that better. We should understand how people, maybe more marginalized peoples or minority groups or people with additional needs, etc., how they experience it, and design places that really work for everyone, because they don't work for everyone, they don't work for anyone really. A lot of our work over the last year has focused on this idea of carbon conscious places, and it's really, really interesting to find out, having studied those and done some pilot work on those, that a lot of the issues that come out in making good carbon conscious places are ones that are actually places that have worked quite successfully, we feel, in the time of lockdown and pandemic collaborative places that work well together and enable people to be able to work well together. We looked at 4 case studies up in Lerwick, Elgin, Strathard, and in Glasgow, and produced what we call 8 principles around what make good carbon conscious places. And there's a document that I can share with you later on, or on our website if you want to find out more about that. And we've looked at these in terms of rural locations, towns, urban neighbourhoods, and city centres, and we've got sort of, I suppose, idealised scenarios around each of those that we can consider. But really, there's this whole idea of better connected places, ones that reuse and recycle, places that share and connect with each other, make better use of green infrastructure and blue infrastructure as well. And we really feel that these principles are a good lens to actually interrogate our future place plans, and also interrogate our existing places in terms of how they work or don't work. So the 8 principles: a place-led approach, a place of small distances, a network of small distance places, places designed for and with local people, places that reuse, repurpose, reconsider the whole life costs, when it considers whole and circular systems, and a place that supports sharing, and a place, as I've suggested before, that is designed in time. And a place-led approach, we mentioned the place standard tool, but this idea that actually gets people to think about their place, scrutinise what's happening or not happening or working well in their own place, how we reflect on that. And so people have got a kind of conversation that's based around that place rather than their own pet concerns, I guess. A place of small distances, there's a lot of talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods. There's been earlier talk about 15-minute cities in Paris, but this idea of how do you support the creation of self-sufficient walkable places, and notwithstanding some of the concerns that was raised earlier on around density, etc., but this idea of density versus sprawl, that kind of, I suppose, self-reliance in that area, and how that's enabled through the design of existing places, but also new places that we're creating. Also, this idea of a network of small distance places, and we've used examples of the Borders Railway, for example, that there are lots of places that are reliant in their own right, but also connect and maybe share some services, etc., through how they're connected. So this idea of a network of small distance places is one that we feel works in terms of a carbon conscious future. And I mentioned before, a place designed for and with local people. We know that when people are not engaged with, big mistakes can happen. We know that when local knowledge isn't fully understood by experts, things are missed. And whilst there has been a bit of a trend towards slagging off experts, which we don't like. I think there's a real match of professional expertise and learning expertise with local expertise, and I think that collaborative approach around that is really, really important. There's some very good examples. We've suggested one up in Huntly, where an arts-led project which collaborated with professional experts and local communities worked really, really well to understand almost that kind of place identity, place branding, and brought that to the fore. Places that reuse, repurpose to the whole life costs are really, really important, and I think that can be is very well exhibited in the built environment, but also I think in terms of landscapes, this idea of supporting reuse of our landscapes and buildings, repurposing in materials, repurposing uses, and this kind of longer term view of the life cycle of a development, not just at the building level, but at the whole place level is really, really important. And we feel that is starting to have some traction now, that kind of approach, but we really need to think like that. And a place that has whole and circular systems, that I talked about blue and green infrastructure, but I think we need to think about, food production, connectivity, digital infrastructure, heating, lighting, waste, water, how these are better designed. I mean, we've used the example of Grey to Green in Sheffield, which is very much about the handling of water, but I think we need to get much, much more sophisticated working with our engineer colleagues in the handling of that. And certainly, in our conversation recently with the expansion of Perth West, the conversation around the use of water, the existing systems of water, but also new built systems of water, how that can be integrated. It's really, really current. And a place designed in time, I mean, I think that's a really, really important thing. I mean, this idea of, having a 10, 20, 30-year plan of how things will get used, that kind of really investing in that conversation. If you don't do that, I mean, you're really, really not investing in the place. I mean, quite often some investments are short-term investments, some are longer-term ones. I think we've got to marry the short-term investments with the mid and longer-term ones as well. We quite often do sort of scenario planning with people, and we kind of get them to look through sort of utopian futures and dystopian ones, which are not so difficult just now. And I think there's a whole conversation there about, really interrogating the decisions we make now, putting yourself in the future 30 years from now and saying, what would the letter I would write to my younger self be, for example? A kind of back to the future type scenario, thinking, if I want to get to a better place in the future, so have a clear understanding of what that is, what do I need to do now and in the mid term to get there as well? So that kind of idea of working backwards in terms of our planning at big scale and at big time is really, really important. And I think, again, as landscape architects, that kind of landscape scale and landscape time frame is a useful contribution that we can make and share with our professional partners and sister agencies. So I mentioned the principles there and of the carbon conscious places. It really sits side by side with another document we produced a year or two before, mainly around town centre living, but about a caring place. And there's lots of commonality there. This idea of, better connectivity, more social spaces, places that work for as many people as possible, the most marginalised. And I think when you sit the two together and read them together, there's a lot of alignment. And I think if you were to do a separate document about designing for a pandemic, much of what you'd write there, I think, and it's borne out by what I've heard from both Petra and Ashraf, is there are certain qualities that make a good quality place, and there needs to be something that is human-led, but also has a degree of flexibility in it, that it can adapt to change. So building in resilience is about also building in flexibility and variety. And I think that's really important. That came through those two pieces of work that we've worked on a lot. So a bit of a plug at the end just now in the last couple of slides, really, just to say that Architecture and Design Scotland, we're here to talk to people. We're here to work with other agencies, and we work a lot with the Key Agencies Group now, who kind of help at that kind of bigger scale with various different local authorities and big developments. But we also do direct consultation with communities and advice workshops with councils. So, you know, we help facilitate conversations. I guess we've got a good skill set around all of that, around visioning, scenario planning, personas, etc. I mentioned before. We do a lot around sort of sharing information from some of our resources, so we can, you know, if we've got design panels, we've also got materials library. So there's a lot of stuff we can share there. Our materials library is in the Lighthouse, closed down unfortunately just now, but we have there's a virtual version of that people can look at. And we have a public sector client forum and a local urban design forum as well. So we're collaborating with a lot of people constantly. So I think we're here. We're welcome to be approached. Please do approach us. And, you know, we have talked about, and many people have talked about, this pandemic sort of accelerating us 5 years into the future. And I think it really has done, and I think it has sharpened our minds. It has brought to head some of the issues that we're perhaps all coasting on. So I think this conversation today is really, really pertinent, really welcome. I'm most grateful to have had the opportunity to be involved in it. So I hope that's touched upon some of the things that I think are the priorities for landscape architects and other professions at the moment, and happy to take questions at the end along with the others. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danny. That's most appreciated. I think there's so much packed into that in terms of the eight principles is a nice summary, but actually there were lots of other points I think to take away. And one of the key things that jumped out to me is something you said quite early on about the places that work successfully from a carbon conscious perspective seem to have worked really well during the pandemic. And I'm quite curious as to whether that's because they had quite a healthy space focused brief, potentially a more detailed approach, potentially more collaboration. So I think there's obviously a lot to be learned there. It'd be interesting to tease that out. So I think that was a really key point for me. So thank you for that, and look forward to getting questions in on that talk at the end. Our next speaker will probably build on that as well, I imagine, in terms of the built environment. Catherine Cosgrove, who is an associate at Austin Smith Lord. Catherine's an architect, a project director and lead of the Practices Sustainability Group. Her proven track record in creating sustainable design solutions is really evident through the many BREEAM certified projects she's delivered. And in 2018, Austin Smith Lord were awarded BREEAM EcoBuild Architect Champions, being recognised by the BRE and having an exemplary track record in sustainable design. Catherine's continued interest into the traditional use of sustainable design strategies, constructions and materials has led her work on many conservation projects, and she's recently been awarded the RIAS Conservation Accreditation. Catherine is the current chair of the Scottish Ecological Design Association, CEDA, and is also a member of the RIAS Sustainability Working Group, for which I'm very grateful, and does a lot of work with the RIAS. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting CEDA to be part of this. I'm here really to make the case for a better balance of nature, and to consider maybe how we can adapt our thinking, adapt how we approach nature in terms of design, so that it's more of a partnership rather than trying to control it. So a little bit about CEDA. We were founded 30 years ago. This is an anniversary year for us, to promote design of communities and projects and systems and services, all sorts of things, all sorts of people, but with the key goal of trying to not harm living species, not harm anything that's round about us, and having a broad membership of people and experiences is actually key to CEDA's success. We've got nearly 300 members just now. We're happy to speak to anyone anytime about any things, but I think it's quite interesting in this being our sort of 30th anniversary to look back onto actually the principles on which we were founded, and we've got two ecological quotes that are actually written into our constitution, and looking back on these, and I've been doing this a lot recently, these are so relevant today. In fact, it's when you look at them now with the context that we're within, then you start thinking, well, okay, ideas haven't really changed, but the context that we're looking at these ideas has changed. And maybe there's an opportunity now to remind everybody that here are principles that actually should be at the root of everything that we do. So basically, we're aiming to minimise the environmental impact of anything that could potentially disrupt cycles which are already in place. And actually, this isn't a momentary thing. This is over a long period of time. So we're aiming to try and have things that fit together gracefully over a long period of time and work with the local environment and ecology. And actually, there are quite well-established principles. So as how this is structured, I'm aiming to identify these principles, give you some issues to consider, point out some opportunities, and maybe put forward a few things just to spark your imagination. So ecological design. It begins with an intimate knowledge of a particular place. And this is something that other speakers have already started earlier today thinking about it. But really think about what is there already. What is there? How does it work? What's the weather like? How do people use the environment? What is present? Because we're trying to work in harmony. We're not trying to disrupt what's happening here. So maybe what we should be thinking about is how did nature evolve? How did things happen over a long period of time that have stood the test of time? Can buildings manage to do the same? Do you have something which is responsive to the environment, responsive to the weather, and is actually something which is more resilient as a result? And the benefit to this is it's cheaper to operate, it's cheaper to maintain, it lasts longer because you're working with the place, not against it. And actually something we should be considering is we have broken many of these links. So can we use new buildings or places or adapt existing buildings to repair some of the damage that's happened in the past? Can we enhance the local biodiversity? Can we relink places together? Can we help repair the habitats? In which case we're part of the solution, not causing the problem. And I'll give you just a few ideas here. One that I've seen recently of a hotel in Norway. The people who were designing this said, well, actually the best thing about this site is the view, and we don't want to put a building in the way that blocks the view. So, okay, why don't we put the building underground? And you think, okay, there's a good point to that. And it's something that, you know, again, looking at the long life of this, it hasn't really disrupted the place too much. It's something that has worked with the environment that it sits within. This isn't a new idea. Think about Scarabray and Orkney. You know, communities were embedded in the ground. You know, so I'm not saying everything has to be like this, but it's an interesting concept to think, well, why should we be setting everything above the ground? Why don't we mimic nature in a more physical way? And picking up on some of the comments that have been raised in earlier presentations, why don't we bring more nature back into the buildings we've already got? There's quite a few well-established projects around the world of actually having urban farming within towns and cities, on rooftops, on flat rooftops. And actually think about that. I mean, it's something where you go, okay, yeah, there's going to be problems there, but look at the benefits. Look at the benefits that you've got here. You've changed the supply chain. It's now local. You're bringing more biodiversity into urban environments. It's certainly healthier. People can work there as a break from where they're working during the day. It's something which very much from a sort of mental point of view is a great release, a stress release issue to be able to come and work with the nature for a small period of time. And actually, when you start thinking about this, you go, okay, right, it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. They can share the same space. You go, okay, right, there's potential here. And maybe for new buildings, one of the things you should be considering is, well, can we build this in from the start? You know, buildings don't have to be all hard surfaces. Ecological accounting. One of the least well-known things about any construction project or any built environment project is what the actual ecological impact of all the things that you use are. And it's tracing back, where did things come from? How did they get made? When supply chains are quite long, it's very difficult to understand all the different processes that have happened to change, something from one thing to another, to move it from one place to another. The ecological impact is minimized from the end user point of view because they just don't know. And that's the situation where we're in just now. We're starting to ask the questions about, where did that come from? And how did you do this? How much energy was used in it? And importantly, you should be asking the question now, was there pollution involved in that? Have we just outsourced the problems to somewhere else? Is it toxic? Have we done damage? Embodied carbon is something that we're talking about. Embodied pollution is something we should be talking about. Embodied toxicity is something we should be considering as well. These are all quite critical issues about how we, people in general, are using the resources of the environment. And this is something which, when we start looking at energy and embodied carbon, it's the start of a conversation. There are other things that will lead on from this. So I'm dropping this into, the conversation just now so you can start considering it. The opportunities available for us with this are, for a start, reuse existing materials, because all of these processes have already happened. We should try and maximise the use of what we've already got. And using local source materials is also quite a critical thing, because with the supply chain being much shorter, it's easier for you to actually say, where did that come from? How did it come to be like this? What impact have you had? And you can check it out and see it yourself. And this is actually just returning back to how things actually used to be. This is exactly how construction worked for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's only really the last 70 years that this has been disrupted and supply chains have got longer, and we are much more further removed from the source where everything came from. So going back to using local crafts and skills and local companies starts to make more sense whenever you're using the local materials, because there's a knowledge base there. And it also helps to support communities. I think that's absolutely critical to say, we're not just trying to do the best for the ecology, we are trying to do the best for our communities. So by sharing the knowledge, keeping things local, we're actually strengthening communities as well. And critically, by reusing what we've got, it retains the existing resources for future generations, because at the moment, we are just burning through the resources of the planet. And this is interesting because this came up on an earlier slide. The Lilac Community Housing in Leeds, which is a low-impact living community, co-housing, is actually quite clever in terms of a volumetric approach to ecological design, because these buildings were made from off-site straw panels. So the insulation in all the walls is straw panels. The system used, ModCell, is quite well tried and tested, but it gives us a way of using ecological materials in a volume house building style. And the community is set out on ecological principles. It does have a better balance with nature, and all the materials that are used in it have been considered for their impact on the environment and on the people in the buildings. You can go and see this. They are very keen to talk to people about how it was developed. And it shows you that if you're approaching housing, in particular, with an ecological mindset, there are ways to be able to deliver this economically. So designing with nature. Nature is a great teacher of how to make things the most efficient way possible, because there isn't waste in nature. Processes have evolved over the years to use every single part of the process, and it's cyclical, so that what you might consider waste is actually the key thing to something else living. There are many integrated ecosystems and processes, all of which are independent on each other. And without realising it, it is very easy for us to disrupt these processes, which have evolved over many, many years of time. What we're doing just now is an awful lot of short-term thinking. The other side of this, that's our impact upon nature, but how nature impacts upon us is much less well understood. And there's a whole series of building biology principles that really should be more considered. And in these post-pandemic times, I would like to think that these are going to become much more relevant, because human biology has evolved to withstand certain environmental conditions. But we've started changing all of that. You know, we're using all sorts of new materials. We're doing things in a different way. You know, the nature of how we have designed buildings has cut us off from nature, if you pardon that sort of cyclical thinking there. So in cutting ourselves off from daylight and sunlight and you know, hearing the sounds of nature and air quality and all these things are actually causing us more harm than we realise. And I think in 50 years' time, when that generation looks back, they'll go, how was that not obvious? And it's only because we've it's built up over a period of years to get to this point. So ecological design thinking is actually from a point of view of do least harm. You know, what is the potential for the materials and the designs to impact upon the building users? Consider that as the critical thing that derives your design. And there are lots of opportunities available from that. So, for instance, you know, if you're using natural materials, then you don't treat them with too many processes. So they are as natural as possible. Use materials when you're not depleting the resources, for instance, coppiced timber, which again was a very traditional method. Reducing environmental stress on people is actually one of those hidden consequences to environmental design, and people are generally not aware of it. But if you start focusing on the ecological issues, you're actually removing some of the hidden stresses that are affecting people. And whenever there is the potential for future pandemics, actually shouldn't we be starting looking at people and saying, what can we do to help people have the best health they possibly can on a day-to-day basis? Then we're in a better place to fight off pandemics. This is a very interesting project in Germany, which I first saw at an RIAS conference 20 years ago in Germany. And at that time, it was so far ahead of the game. And I think it still is so far ahead of the game in terms of ecology as a kind of technical subject. In the Prisma building in Germany, it's a mixed housing, offices, commercial development, takes up a whole city block. But an awful lot of what you would have considered as being an M&E based approach is actually carried out by nature, by ecology. So there's a tremendous integration of planting and ecological principles inside the building, and how the buildings are structured, and how water is used around about it, how air is used. It basically sets up a microclimate inside the building to deal with many of the things that M&E services would traditionally use. That at the time blew my mind whenever I learned about it. And even now I'm looking at how we design buildings today and thinking, why do we keep trying to replicate nature without actually using nature? This seems crazy. There is such a potential in being able to fully integrate nature into buildings, fully integrate nature's processes inside buildings. And as a result, we're not fighting nature, we're working with nature. And echoing some of the comments that others have made earlier this morning, everyone as a designer is quite a critical principle. Because think about it, everyone nests, everyone makes their own living environment. Everybody makes their own home, everybody changes their workspaces instinctively. These are intuitive things. People learn what works for them by changing things. And that actually is something which should be applied on a much broader scale. Sharing experiences, talking to people, learning from other people is absolutely critical to embedding knowledge in cultures and communities. And it promotes a better understanding of why things happen, what the impact is on different things. It makes it easier to understand common values and what could disrupt the common values. These are critical things in how societies develop. And actually, if we get back to that, what you're doing is empowering communities to make decisions that impact upon the whole of the community over a longer period of time. Having people have a say in what surrounds them and what they see every day is absolutely the most important way to build resilience in communities. It is better both mentally and physically, for everyone's health and for the community. It builds resilience. It's the type of thing which, in our CEDA conference that we had last year, we were looking at rural and urban communities and how they were focused, what happened in the pandemic time, how did they survive, what was important to them. And it became quite apparent that actually the rural communities were very resilient and were able to cope very quickly and very well, because that's what they were used to doing. And it shows the value of community. So going forward, we shouldn't be looking at individual places and people. We're looking at how communities exist. How can we support communities? How can you build community? What's important in terms of communities? And in an ecological term, that is completely the way that nature works. And also, when you have local solutions to local problems, these can be shared on a much wider basis. There's lots of different solutions that will evolve from this approach, and then they can be shared. And we can all learn different ways of doing things, and it promotes all sorts of different solutions, which will continue to evolve, and that is critical. Here's a wee example of this, very interesting from an awful lot of different points of view. In Zurich, the local council decided that they would involve the community from the outset in Kalkbreid when they were redeveloping the area. The money for the development was provided by the Zurich Council Pension Fund. So the council owned the land and they are providing the funding. So it's in their interests that this is a successful community, because the rent from that is going to be paying pensions for years to come. But getting the community involved at an early stage, and they were saying, well, what's important? What's important to this community? And one of the things that came out of that was, well, we would like to keep our local library, please. We don't want it closed down. We would like to have children's facilities. We would like local shops. We would like everybody to have a view. We would like to make sure that, we've got the best of the ecological design, so everyone's got nice warm houses. And you go, okay, right. These are actually quite critical to how the community functions, but it has a placemaking aspect to it as well. And this is an ecologically built building. It's all done in ecological sound principles. It's a low energy building. And what you've done there is established a community that is already working well before anything was actually built, but it has all the right things in place for that to be a long-term successful community. And it's an asset for the council. This is an ideal way to redevelop our communities and build in value and minimise risk and all the issues that we've been talking about earlier today. And another one, which was just touched on a wee bit earlier, is making nature visible. This is actually, it's maybe hasn't been noticed as much until when the COVID pandemic and the lockdown caused everything to stop and all the travelling to stop. Then people started hearing the sounds of nature again. Nature was always there. It was just drowned out by everything else. And that's one of the things that you start to notice, that an awful lot of nature's processes weren't very obvious to us. It would be very easy for you to leave your house in the morning, travel to work with having headphones on, looking at the phone screen in front of you, on public transport that has no greenery around about you, to get to your office, to sit in front of a computer all day. And if you went out, it was all hard landscaping round about, to get back into your office and repeat the whole thing going back. Where's the nature in all of that? We were quite disconnected when you think about it. And actually the processes of how we are living are boxed up into different sections. You don't see where your energy comes from. You don't see where the waste goes. You don't know how things are grown. The system isn't very obvious as to how it works, because it has all been compartmentalised. And because it's compartmentalised, because it's out of sight, that makes it someone else's problem. And we don't really consider nature in our decisions, because we don't see how our actions are affected it. And this goes back to the supply chain that was mentioned before. If we're removed from the source of your actions, there's a time lag between decisions that you make and the effect that it has. And it's a very difficult concept to get across, because if there's an immediate reaction to something you've done, then that's going to influence your behaviour. there's a very long time between what has been impacted by your decision, then you've already forgotten about it, you're on to the next thing. So actually seeing your impact and recognising how nature is playing a part in your day-to-day life will then influence the decisions that you make. So the opportunities for that is that you start making a more explicit visual ecology that's connected to all these systems. And simple things like that are, using trees to provide shading, using swales in wetlands. That's something I know in Wales. They don't allow any suds drainage to be underground anymore. It all has to be above ground. Bosco verticale, there's a way of making ecology at an extremely large scale. And you might think, oh yeah, that's kind of a wee bit over the top, but that's quite an interesting way of living. Environmentally very good. Maybe we could do that on a medium scale. I'm just saying. And I'll just give you a sort of insight into the future. Future is already here. Very good example of all of these is in the Right to Build housing in Tübingen in Germany. This whole site was in the grounds of a former military barracks, and the ecological principles were designed in at planning stage. Nature has to have a certain percentage of the footprint on the site. There is design codes for materials to use, and all ecologically based. There's a lot of self-build, there's a lot of co-housing, there's a lot of community stuff. The communities of the future are not very different to the communities of now. It just requires a little bit more ecological thinking. And a wee plug for CEDA, we have our Land Vision conference coming up in the next couple of months online, and we're going to be talking to a lot of people from Scottish Natural Heritage, from James Hutton Trust, a lot of ecological thinkers, and it's all about conversations with how we can move forward. If you want to hear more of this, please sign up. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a very interesting series of events. And if you want any more, please come to our website, ceda.uk.net. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. That's hugely appreciated, and lots of information there again to add to the discussion. I think we're probably all focused on the kind of headphones on, ignoring landscape, and the mode that we used to operate in, and the way to getting to work and from work. And I think you're completely right, and it encapsulated, and I think it made me think about everything else you said in terms of how we used to function in our engagement with nature. It's on a very one-to-one level, and it's really interesting because it frames everything else that you were talking about, which is a fantastic way to look at it and make it personal to everyone, not just design professionals, not just people looking at architecture and the built environment, but absolutely everyone. It makes it relatable, which is, absolutely key during these discussions. So I want to move on now to our last panelist, who's John Olson, who's a research fellow, and leads the Mobility and Place workstream within the Places and Health programme at the MRC/SCO Social and Public Health Sciences Unit, which is the SPHSU. As a health geographer, John's research interests are in spatial I can't even say this word, so I'm hoping he's going to explain it. Epidemiology, sorry about that, and my terrible pronunciation, and population health. Hopefully, John, you'll explain that to me in your opening paragraph and pronounce it correctly for everyone here. Sorry about that. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for inviting me here today. So it's a spatial epidemiologist, which is, we're hearing a lot about epidemiologists at the moment who understand how disease affects people and populations. And as a spatial epidemiologist, it's really bringing that understanding of how health of the population changes, but very much with a spatial thinking of that. Really, health geographics is where I sit. So hopefully that explains it. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk today, and the speakers have been really fascinating. I've enjoyed the conference so far. And I'm going to talk about use and experience of green space during lockdown and present some of the data that we've collected during the lockdown period to see how really this has impacted people's health and how using that green space has changed. And it really fits in with the previous speaker, especially that ecological design principle 5, which we're talking about, is maybe people have more time to use green space, And what we've done is try to then see if people do have more time, how they're using it, if they are using it more, and if that impacts their health. What I really wanted to touch on firstly is to highlight some of the evidence around the benefits of nature and health. And a lot of the evidence shows us that contact with nature is healthy. And this is both for children and adults. And actually the variety in how it works and how it affects us is really quite remarkable. And we know that just seeing green can really impact our mental health. So looking out the window, how it relates to architecture, we know a lot of green street furniture can really have positive health outcomes. Plus actually being in nature is even greater benefits, especially those physical health benefits that you may get, whether it's just walking, socializing, or an opportunity for physical activity within these spaces. And I think what we need to focus on hugely for a population like the United Kingdom and Scotland is what about those people who live in urban areas? And we know the United Nations tells us that around 50% of the world's population live in urban areas. And by 2050, we expect around 2/3 of the world population to live in cities. And Scotland especially is the majority of the population live in the central belt, so a highly densely populated area of the country. And looking at some evidence from England, which has looked at small areas, so it's looked at small administrated areas such as census tracts, which is they're actually the smaller ones in England, so similar to the Scottish data zone, which are small polygon areas that are sort of postcode sectors that collect a number of different houses. And what this research study did was it wanted to look at the association between access to natural environments and population health. So what it did was it measured each of those small administrative units and then looked at the amount of that space which was green and measured this. Then it compared it on this graph that you can see here. On the y-axis we have 100, which is the English average, and we can say as the death rate moves higher, which is bad, there's more deaths compared to the rest of England. And as we go below 100, we can see that the death rate is lower than the average in England. And what this graph really nicely shows that is for across the entirety of England, that as these small administrative areas became increasingly green, so as the percentage of that area became greener, as did deaths from heart disease for people aged 30 plus who live in those areas. So really concrete evidence there that shows an association between those small areas being greener and positive health outcomes in terms of lower mortality compared to the rest of England. And in research that has looked at collating lots of smaller studies, so it's conducted a meta-analysis, a systematic review of looking at all of these individual studies that have looked at green space exposure and health, and then look to see how that evidence, when it's collated together, what are the main messages. And for a number of biomarkers, we can see that having greater exposure has got positive impacts on those biomarkers, such as salivary cortisol, heart rate, cholesterol, and also some key health indicators. And this is one that I think most people can relate to, which is good self-reported health. So the collection of synthesizing the evidence together shows those studies do show that greater exposure to nature has a benefit in people reporting greater self-reported health, lower preterm birth, lower type 2 diabetes, lower all-cause mortality, similar to the English study I just showed, and a number of health outcomes. So it really is showing the benefits of being in nature, being in greener places, and a number of health outcomes. Well, what about coronavirus? And I think a lot of the presentations today have touched on this, that nature, we feel nature, we speak to people, people present it, and we can really see that nature a lot of people say, has got us through this lockdown, has really helped us getting through the coronavirus situation. It's given us a place to go. It's one of the only places we can go, but actually people are saying it's a great benefit. So what about the evidence? And that's something that we've been involved around, is trying to take this anecdotal evidence that people talk about and see what this means in larger population-based studies to provide greater evidence for policy and practitioners. And we've been working with Public Health Scotland, who've been organising the COVID-19 response in Scotland, and they've set up a number of different social and system recovery cells. And at the University of Glasgow, we're a member of the Evidence and Spaces Cell, which includes partners from national and local government, NHS boards, the third sector and academia, and I know SEPA are a member of this and contribute to these groups. And the group was really established to bring together evidence on how our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our environment and space, and then how people have interacted with these. And then what we want to do is, with this evidence, articulate how this might impact on people's health and well-being, and especially, which is something my research focuses on, is health inequalities. So the differences for population groups, such as by age, gender, and socioeconomic status, so differences between the richest and poorest in society. And then hopefully this evidence can help to inform national and local responses through policy and practice. So what evidence have we do? Well, most of the results that we've done are from 2 surveys. Well, there's actually 4 now, because we've just conducted one more in November, as has our colleagues at Nature Scott, SNH, as it was previously called. And our study, we worked with YouGov and conducted the outside space and COVID study. And this was conducted during the stay-at-home phase of the COVID-19 lockdown. And we had over 2,200 responses from people across the UK. And I'm also going to present some results from Nature Scott, who kindly allowed me to share their results, which was conducted slightly later when COVID-19 restrictions on movements were slightly eased. And this is around 1,000 respondents across Scotland only. So I think it's important to show how people previously interacted with nature and how many people actually report that they use and visit the outdoors in the previous 12 months. So I don't know what you would expect, but around 80% of the population say that they visited and spent time in green space over the previous 12 months. That was pre-coronavirus. So I don't know whether that's high or lower, so about 4 and 5 people are visiting the green space. But I think what's key in this chart, and what I really want to emphasize, is those differences by population group. So we can see it's much higher for people of a higher social grade. So the more affluent in society, around 90% of them reported that they used green space in the past 12 months. Then those who have children, paid employment, and no illnesses, and who report good health, and younger individuals. Whereas we can see that those in the red with lower, who reported they use green space much less, are really those in bad, poor health, who are of a lower social grade, and those aged eldest. So we can really see those differences in use between the people with good health, affluent, and those with poor health and less affluent. And how did this change as we entered the COVID-19 lockdown? Well, we can see differences. We can see a number of people did report a loss in the amount of time they spent outdoors. And that could be contributed to the stay-at-home message, which we're currently back under, which is saying stay at home and try not to visit it as much, which we know during the previous lockdown phase, we were told to only visit space once a day, which currently we're not under those restrictions, but they are currently under discussion. But we can see that really highlighted some differences in how people changed their use. So we can see there were people who increased their use of green space, and those with females and people of younger age and those of higher social grade. So we can really start to see that actually the COVID-19 pandemic and people using green space may actually contribute to a widening of inequalities where people of high social grade are using it more and lower social grade using it less. So it could be exacerbating those inequalities, which in turn is quite important because we think about those health benefits. It could then be influencing those health benefits so that maybe more affluent people are again gaining greater benefit of the green space and outdoors. And when we did this in more complex analysis, we can see that only around 15% of participants reported an increase in visits. And again, that's probably likely to the messages of government policy saying, stay at home largely most of the time. But the lower social grades reported around were 50% less likely to have increased green space visits than the higher social grades. And older participants were less likely to have increased their visits compared to the middle age group, which again, that could be likely to older people being more at risk of coronavirus and potentially shielding, and therefore being more likely to spend time at home to protect their health. And I think this is really interesting because it looks at how people have changed where they're spending time compared to a year ago. And we can see there are places where people have increased where they're spending time when they go outdoors, and especially roadside and street pavements. And if we think back to those earlier times of the pandemic, when we were very much at the stay-at-home message and people weren't returning to work, a lot of people, there was an increase in people using roadside and street pavements for their outdoor time and exercise. And we could imagine that was due to less traffic and people maybe perceiving these as safer places. And also more time in path tracks, which are away from the roadside, and woodland and forest. And there were places that decreased use, which was beach, seas and lochs, which maybe require more travel time to get there, which is outside that limit of 5 miles outside your local authority that we're advised to stick with. And this is a really important slide here, and this shows how people have reported green and open spaces has benefited their mental health. And we can see about 2/3 of people are reporting that spending time in green and open space has benefited their mental health. This is slightly higher for younger individuals and again higher for people of higher social grade. And our most recent results that were conducted in November 2020, it's showing an increase of 80% of people are saying that being in green space, they feel it is benefiting their mental health. So maybe, as we just talked about in the previous talk, maybe people are realizing the real benefits of spending time in green space. And as they're using green space and more consciously go into these spaces, the benefits are maybe becoming more prominent in their mind. But I think in terms of the differences between the higher and lower social grade, this could also be differences in spending time there could be due to potentially more higher social grades being able to work from home. And therefore they don't have commuting time, so are able to actually spend more time in nature, as opposed to jobs which are particularly undertaken by the lower social groups may actually not be able to work at home, so then may have to travel to the workplace and don't actually have the time to increase their green space use. So some important things to think about green space use and how it is benefiting different people. So what this slide shows is how the number of visits to any green space have increased or decreased. And this is using data from our most recent survey in November. And it's showing compared to a year ago, that most people have reported an increase a lot or a little now to spending green space than they did a year ago, which is really good. More people are spending time. But if we look at it by social group, so the ABC1 are the higher social grade, so the more affluent people of society, and they are the people who are reporting mostly they've either increased a lot or a little. And if we look at the C2DE, which is the lowest social grade, they're actually reporting a decrease a lot now. So there are these differences by different population groups. So as we quite often talk about those benefits, those increases in use, and we can feel nature and it's having a great impact on health, this is maybe not felt by all in society and something that we really need to concentrate on in terms of those inequalities. And something quite positive to look at is how people have reported the visits at least once a week. And this is data from SNH, Nature Scott as they're now called. And this shows that compared to March 2019, where 60% of people said they visited a green and outdoor space once a week, the latest figures from Nature Scott in mid-August were that 80% of people visited at least once a week. And this has increased significantly in terms of those people, around a third saying every day and another third saying several times a week. So actually, although people are increasing the amount of time they are visiting, those frequencies of visits are also increasing. So people are spending and engaging with green and open door spaces a lot more. So the data I've talked about there were published in the report that we jointly published with Public Health Scotland around environments and spaces, and that's free to access, and we'd encourage you to look at this report, and hopefully in the coming months we'll be providing an update with the latest data from Nature Scott and our surveys that I've touched on today. But the recommendations in that report for policy and practitioners are firstly to recognise that not everybody used outdoor space more as a result of lockdown, and there were marked falls in use among some groups, most notably older individuals who maybe are spending more time at home and protecting their health. And also number two was to redress the marked reduction in use by older people, and this could be done through a combination of outreach, working groups and community action. And then also to touch on to readdress the underlying socioeconomic inequality in both access to green space and use of public and private open space. And that's remembering that different people have different circumstances. So maybe the most affluent are able to work from home and have more time due to lack of commuting, although we know that isn't the case now with children at home and homeschooling. But there are some of the recommendations that are highlighted in that report. And the report is able to access using this link, or you could Google Public Health Scotland Green and Open Space Report. And I'd just like to thank my colleague, Professor Rich Mitchell, and also our PhD student, Hannah Burnett, who spent a lot of time doing this analysis. And just to highlight our funding at the Medical Research Council, CSO, Social and Public Health Sciences Unit. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think, it's really grounding, I think, to see those statistics and to reinforce the conversations that came, before yourself today, and kind of look at especially that change in spend of time in the environment, linking to Catherine's, conversation about nature and bringing nature in, recognizing nature, and also to build on what Danny said in terms of successful development with landscape architecture. So I think that's been really beneficial. Sorry, there's a little bit of playback there for me. I hope that anyone else can't hear it. It might be that everyone for the Q&A is now turning on their mics. So potentially how we might be able to manage that is that I'll propose a question and throw it out to someone, and then we can just turn mics on and stop that feedback from affecting anyone listening in, if that's okay. We have quite a lot of questions that have come in, which are fantastic. The first one came in quite early on from David Major, asking if there are any existing networks that allow built environment professionals to connect with other disciplines. And I think it's a really interesting question. I know that there's a lot of collaboration at professional body level, but in terms of built environment professionals connecting potentially, institutions like, I'm trying to think of an example. CEDA, for example, is a collection of built environment professionals, so potentially allows that collaboration. Catherine, I don't know whether you want to comment on that a little bit more, or know anything further than myself.
Well, we've always felt that that we need to have more people involved in the conversation. So we say at every single presentation, we welcome more people from different backgrounds to join, because that gives us more voices are heard, more information to us, and that spread of people is completely beneficial to everybody, I have to say. We felt ourselves in the last couple of years, we've focused a lot on architecture. So what we're aiming to try and do over the next couple of years is to broaden out the discussions that we have to other things, which is why we're doing the LAN conference just now. I don't know of any other equivalent sort of networking opportunity that's out there. I don't know of any other built environment forums that are really quite that broad. There probably are other ones, but they're not not well known.
Danny, do you want to jump in? You've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I was going to just mention a thing that we kind of help facilitate. It's called the local authority urban design forum. Now it's for local government officers, but and they tend to chair it themselves, albeit facilitated by us. And that tends to have quite a broad range of professional backgrounds, people, you know, planners, urban designers, engineers, landscape architects, architects coming in. And we tend to have, you know, there's usually 2 sessions, 3 sessions a year. And there used to be, so there's usually a topic. So it might be, you know, landscape design, it might be pedestrians, it might be water, you know, so there'll be a themed heading, but it's very much a collaborative approach, which is promoted that, and it is multidisciplinary. One thing I would touch upon as well, and it is interesting that, you know, I think we've all touched upon this, but this idea of multidisciplinary education as well. I was very aware, you know, I came into landscape architecture through the postgraduate model, having previously studied geography and physics and a pile of other things. But what was interesting about the postgraduate course was that we had, you know, architects, geographers, archaeologists, classicists, ecologists, etc., all coming in together. And I would say we come out of it as quite well-rounded bunch of, you know, peer-educated people. And I think there's this idea of kind of doing this when you're already a professionally formed person is almost too little, too late. And I think it's been touched upon by some of the other conversations. Ashraf mentioned it right at the beginning. This idea of, you know, collaborative thinking at scales and skills and interests and abilities needs to be at all levels as early and as often as possible.
I think that's a really good point, Danny, because essentially, if there's sometimes the further you get through your career as well, the more fragmented procurement and design processes come, and sometimes it's almost harder as a professional to search for that engagement. Whereas actually, if it's integrated at that early level, you don't question it; should just happen. And I think that's a really interesting point. The second question we have is, how can we manage the density in communities after violent conflicts that need to enhance trust and participation with the requirements of social distancing and reduced participation after the pandemic? I think that's really interesting with what's going on globally at the moment. And Ashraf, I'm going to put you in the hot seat, as I feel that you'll be best positioned to respond to that. Sorry, you're just on mute, Ashraf. Sorry, thank you.
That's okay. No, thank you very much. I think the question is really important, but at the same time, very, very complex. And I would relate here to the notion of responsive governance. If we have responsive governance and that look at the built environment in terms of those 3 components, the imagined, the measured, and the experienced, and we center our discussions on the collaboration between those 3 types of spaces, we'll be able to develop models that address whether post-conflict, during conflict, post-crisis, during crisis, all of these aspects. But I think flexibility and the generation of responsive urban governance models would enable density management, would enable addressing complex problems in the urban environment.
Yeah, I think it's hard to answer that because you don't know how people are going to react to certain things. So like you say, there's a modeling aspect, but there's a human interaction aspect that sometimes we can never predict. And I think that that flexibility has come up through almost every conversation we've had today. And it's how to design for that, I think, is a real challenge across all disciplines, or even procure, approach, collaborate, instigate community discussion. I think it has to be quite a new approach to how we look at things as a whole. And I think it's interesting, the statistics that John brought to the fore to kind of show that research which would inform the models, but then there needs to be that added layer on top. So I think everything, it's starting to produce a narrative to follow, but it's building up those layers and ensuring that collaboration. A question from
Christina, can I just come into that, please? A couple of points. Earlier on, it was talked about professional networks and how we can do that. 2 years ago, we set up the Alliance for People in Place, which has now 17 organizations from a wide variety of backgrounds. So that includes organizations like the professional outfits like RIAS, RTPI, but also organizations like Town Centre Regeneration, various youth organizations, allotment holders. It's just to understand that place is very, very complex, and it has lots and lots of woven, but it belongs to all of us. So therefore, when we sit around to discuss National Planning Framework 4 and its impact on climate change alleviation, we all need to be in that room. So I think it's very important that we're not just focusing on professionals, but professionals in various different disguises. And in terms of the second question around participation, it is very, very important. We're all familiar with the Arnstein ladder of participation. I think we have now moved a step further where actually people themselves want to lead the discussions, and they want to come up with solutions and then bring those to the professionals in the room, to the elected members. So I think the dialogue is shifting, and we shouldn't always see it as a conflict. If we spend more time, 2/3 of our time, in actual conversation and understanding what we all want, and the how would you say, the aspirations that all communities have, if we spend more time, 2/3 of that, and then the delivery will be made so much easier.
That's a very good point. I'm going to let Danny come in because he has his hand up as well.
Very briefly, in touching upon the first question, just to flag up in terms of cross-professional collaboration, the questioner may wish to look at some of the work that the Academy of Urbanism have been promoting. They're well kind of promoted on Twitter and etc. But the Academy of Urbanism has quite a lot of work, and they certainly have a very broad range of people contributing to that. That's all.
That's really helpful, Danny. Thank you. I agree with you, Petra, as well, in terms of, the place belongs to all of us, and it's just looking at those roots that I think have come up again a few times in discussions today, and going back to that conversation, understanding that narrative that we all need, and I think it's really important. There's a question from Nadia here. Do you think there needs to be an expansion of what constitutes the home zone in order to facilitate more parochial encounters to try and mitigate loneliness and isolation? And this is again quite a complex question, and I think we would all want to try and mitigate loneliness and isolation. I don't know whether anyone wants to pick this up or try and respond. Ashraf?
Okay. Yeah, I just want to give a quick response to this. The two concepts of home zone and home range are coming from animal anthropology. Really, they are based on animal anthropology and the territorial behavior and the idea of the perception of geographical locations. This is why we use dogs in protecting territories and areas. So I would say there is no doubt that there will be a preference to the home zone area rather than the home range, but also this needs to be coupled for mitigation purposes with community facilities, with it was mentioned, intergenerational facilities. These are really important. We don't want to label, for example, older people and have or build or introduce facilities for them only. Now, if you look at the impact of youth or the impact of the pandemic on youth, we never talk about youth. And now people who are 17, 18, 19, 20 years old are locked. And this is the period where they have to have independence from home environments. And now they are ending up for 1 full year living with their parents. So this is really, really problematic. And at different scales and at different levels, definitely home zone and home range would require facilities and also the policy that support this.
Yeah, thanks, Ashraf. John, do you want to come in? I can see your hand up. Sorry, everyone's quite small on my screen, so I hope I'm picking up everyone. Please shout if not.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that as well, because I think we previously used to talk about home neighbourhoods, and we'd quite often define these using small boundaries. And the home neighbourhoods are quite often linked to the decisions and how funding is, whether funding is by local authority, council area, small area. And we were actually moving away from that in terms of thinking about, especially as Ashraf just mentioned, youth services, because we're highly mobile. People wanted to travel to central areas, to say Glasgow, Edinburgh, for these types of areas. But now it is interesting because we're moving back to people temporarily. We don't know how long this will do and whether it will change behaviours, but people are being asked to stay within a home range. So potentially services that have moved to different places to be more centralised, that could affect people who are staying locally, and that will have differences by age. So it is quite an interesting concept as we're trying to move away from home neighbourhoods as we became more mobile, travelled more. So that's...
It's really interesting, John. Thank you. Danny, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well. I mean, anecdotally from the place I live in, which is the village of Eaglesome, interestingly, when the pandemic started off, one of the key things that emerged was that the strength of the existing social networks, both digitally enhanced ones, I guess, but through social media, but also the fact that there was a community of people who knew each other. What that enabled was a very, very fast response to meeting the needs of the more vulnerable, socially isolated people who were newly socially isolated because of the pandemic. And that whilst the proximity and the physicality of a fairly small village or small town enabled that knowledge to be there and quick reactiveness, the social network and the community need to be there as well. So I think there is this kind of whole thing about, we can design things, but then it has to fully understand how we live, how that community lives. The answers were in the community. We could have, and quite often I've worked in local government for many years in the past. We designed up things that the community could have designed or implemented and run much, much more smoothly than a local government could. So there's that kind of thing about really, really asking the community and understanding how they work, where the needs are. And that's really, really important before we actually jump to, I suppose, physical solutions. We actually need to understand what the proper problems are, but also what the capacity is and the skill set is within that set of local experts, as we talked about earlier.
That builds a lot on Petra's point before as well. It's just about starting with that community and kind of that starting point again. We seem to keep coming back to that, so I think it's obviously a very relevant point to take from today.
Can I just add something else, because it was quite interesting. Catherine mentioned a few examples from Europe around green buildings and Zurich and so on. And of course, we sometimes forget that we are, to some extent, we are very much remote in terms of central government to our local communities. And some of those challenges that we're experiencing here in the UK is because of the centralization and the remoteness. So if you can have the infrastructure and the shall we say, the demographic structures in place that can actually allow for that dialogue much, much earlier on. So like in Zurich, where they talked straight away. In Tübingen, it's always been used as an example. But we have to also think, why is it that we're still talking about it rather than delivering it? Because as Catherine said, for 30 years, this has been going on. So yeah, we need to be mindful of what the barriers are and perhaps collectively work on those as well.
Yeah, very much. It's how we do, isn't it? I think we can all probably talk. We all end up talking about the same things, but I think it's that action. It's the changes in the structures and the systems that, allow the built environment to come together and actually answer some of the things that we're building up knowledge. And like you say, have been ongoing for 30 years and actually start implementing. And I think that's a really key point, that action. And it feels like it's always the next step. And I sometimes question, well, if it's forever the next step, then how are we going to get there? So I think it's not all of our responsibility, it's the whole of the built environment, but I think, it is that time for action. And, we've learned so much, especially in the last year, that I think it's, it really is time. There's a few more questions. There's one directed at Ashraf to know if there's been any research on the mental or physical health impacts of pandemic restrictions on those who live in high density and high control cities. I think Catherine might have added an answer to this on the questions. Ashraf, I don't know whether you want to jump in first, and then Catherine, if you want to contribute.
Yeah, just say a couple of things. Actually, WHO, World Health Organization, Europe office, is currently doing a study on cities in crisis and how they respond to the crisis. And density is part of the urban density is part of the parameters of the study. We're trying to contribute to this one, but I don't think there is at this stage something related to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic in high density area and the mental health, the three parameters together. There is one article on BBC which is really very important that refers to other studies in different contexts and look at New York, Mumbai, and other places. And I can share that with you. It's a very good, short article, but refers to many studies, which is a good one on BBC. And there is also another one trying to look at before the pandemic and after the pandemic from a psychological health perspective within the UK. And if we look at the context, basically we can take the results and try to look at the density in these studies and how they looked at different contexts and what is the density in different contexts. And maybe we can develop correlation between the psychological health and urban density.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not sure about pandemic, post-pandemic research. I know one thing that we've focused on in CEDA for many years has been how the indoor environment can affect people who are in them, and specifically how some of the modern materials can affect people in the indoor environment. So obviously, if we are now indoors more, we've been under lockdown, then that's something that's going to become more and more of an issue. Chris Morgan of John Gilbert Architects, who many of you will know, is currently writing a new guide or a new publication about how people can be affected by living in highly controlled environments, which I'm quite interested to find out what research he has picked up upon, because certainly there's a lot of information out there about all the different things that can affect human health in terms of temperature and humidity, but in terms of materials, much less. So that's one of our things that we will be focusing upon over the course of this year. And I would hope that feeds back into some of the post-pandemic research that other people are doing about, more widely spread, how is this affecting a population that we're all stuck indoors for much longer than we had expected.
That's a very good point. It does throw healthy buildings and built environment to the fore, Catherine. So it's a really, really good point to add into that. There's one more question from Murray Smith, and I hope I say this correctly. So do you believe that RIAS should be in direct receipt of government funding specifically for the purpose of setting up specialised interdisciplinary research centres similar to the Future of Humanity Institute? I don't know who wants to pick that up, or if anyone's got any thoughts on it. Silence. Hot. Can I throw anyone into the hot seat? It may be slightly more towards a policy placemaking. Petra, you might be able to comment in terms of, you know, setting up interdisciplinary centres that would allow us to discuss these items a bit more, and should the government be backing incentives like that?
We have a lot of, I think we have a lot of interdisciplinary happening already, and I think centres to, I think what is really needed is maybe a mind shift to say, you know, actually let's have a collective and have it on a regular basis where, you know, maybe we're taking a particular item such from ANDS, or we take another one from universities. There is already the Insight Institute, which is doing quite a lot of interdisciplinary work, and I find that extremely helpful because, as it was said earlier, I find the societal the societal needs of young people and older people coming together, for me, that really is a shift. And interdisciplinary work that is happening with 5 different universities, as well as ourselves and aging groups and young children's organizations, that's what we need to foster, that kind of new collaboration. And I think, yeah, that's what I would like to see.
That's really interesting. Danny, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a real opportunity in today's, you know, kind of touching upon that there needs to be better sharing of, I suppose, experiences and case studies and learning between academia and, I suppose, government agencies. And it does happen, but maybe not always so formally. I mean, we certainly have learning from the work that we do, which is very much kind of sort of assisting practitioners and as a kind of practitioner ourselves. And sometimes, you know, we can be quite distant from the academic learning, but I think we need to maybe collaborate more in terms of those conversations about what's working, what's not working, where the real, you know, I suppose recurrent problems are, or where there's emerging good practice. So this kind of conversation today, I think is very welcome, because it doesn't happen enough. But I would tend to back what Peter is saying. I mean, I don't think we need to set up new organizations all the time, and it's not necessarily about the funding. We don't necessarily need, you know, things are complex enough, as has been hinted upon. We need more a collaborative, joined up approach, and that's about approaches and conversations, as opposed to necessarily always more funding and more organizations. I think we need to actually kind of come together in terms of the governance and sharing of information and experiences and skill sets.
Thank you. I think that defragmentation of effort across the board as well, because I think we you know, a lot of the topics get discussed more than once or in a different way or in lots of different forums, and the same things are being talked about. So it's actually defragmenting that conversation in order to try and pull it together, exactly, you know, picking up on both of your points there. I think that's all of the questions that we've had in today. There was, I don't want to miss this, so there's a comment from Julie Wilson as well, which was in response to David's question, which was Edinburgh University set up the Edinburgh Futures Institute. Sorry, I'm picking up on what, potentially something we've already talked about, but just to make sure everyone's seen it, which is a multidisciplinary research, education and engagement centre to support the navigation of complex futures with industry, government and communities, if anyone wants to check that out as well. I realise that we are 3 minutes over time, so I apologise for that. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any questions from anyone in the room today. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Impact Engagement and Andrew Creeley again for organising this event, and to all of our fantastic speakers today, Ashraf, John, Danny, Petra and Catherine, just for their input, you know, the different perspectives on the topic. And I think, as Danny said before, you know, we don't often get this opportunity in this depth to hear from, you know, a range of people and experiences across the board on this one topic. And I think hopefully we can keep the conversation going a little bit together and pick up on a few strands and knowledge shared today. So thank you to absolutely everyone involved, and thank you to everyone for attending. And I hope everyone stays safe and has a good day. So thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Right,
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.